selfish intent of wanting to preserve peace initiates wars, and hatred is born in order to protect love. Wherever there is light, there will always be shadows to be found as well. Wake up to reality.
What's good, everyone? It's Tim, also known as mtgmeurlin, and today we're going to take a look at my most played cEDH deck, Edo Tensei Reanimator Yuriko. So what's our game plan? To use Yuriko flips and straight to graveyard tutors to fill our yard with big creatures to reanimate and take over the game. If this doesn't work or our graveyard gets shut down, we pivot to a tempo Yuriko game plan with high impact mid-range pieces like the Roaming Throne and Shieldred the Apocalypse to try to outvalue our opponents. Now, let's take a look at the list and see what kind of cards we're playing. In the creature suite, we find many similar cards to normal Yuriko lists, such as Ornithopter, Fairy Seer, the Changelings, and other low mana cost or evasive creatures to get through with Yuriko, ideally on turn 2. But we're also running cards like Putrident and Ghostly Pilferer to pitch large creatures that get stuck in our hands, Fairy Dream Thief to surveil and possibly fill our yard for reanimation targets or prep our top deck for Yuriko triggers, and Stitcher Supplier to quickly fill our graveyard to hit threshold, as we have a number of cards that care about hitting that magic 7 number, such as Cabal Pit. Along with the usual Yuriko creatures, we of course have our reanimation targets. In this iteration of the deck, I'm on 7, and they are Doom Whisperer, Consecrated Sphinx, Nezahal Primal Tide, Hoarding Broodlord, Razaketh the Foul-Blooded, Villis, Broker of Blood, and Jin-Gitaxias, Core Augur. These creatures all have a large impact when they enter the battlefield and either win us the game or provide so much advantage that we're heavily favored to win the following turn. Now let's move on to how we find these cards, the tutors. I'm on the usual Dimir tutor suite, Demonic, Vampiric, Mystical, and Imp Seal, but I'm also running Entomb, Unmarked Grave, and Buried Alive for straight to graveyard tutors. In terms of reanimation, we're of course running Reanimate, Soul Exchange, Dread Return, Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, and Necromancy for instant speed reanimation. This package of cards allows us to almost always have half of what we need at any given time. Our ideal situation is to reanimate either a Hoarding Broodlord or Razaketh to either draw enough cards with the Saw and Half Peer combo, or simply tutor for our win con with enough creatures on the board with Razaketh. Also, worst case scenario, they're both big flying beaters to attack with. Now we are light on mana rocks and enchantments other than the obvious ones we would be running, and the same is true for our interaction. We run the best ones we can that are free, Force of Will, Mindbreak Trap, Fierce Guardianship, Pact, and Misstep, but we don't run too much other free interaction because we have so many other slots that are being taken up by our reanimation package. I know someone will ask why we don't run Commandeer because it's free and it hits big with Yuriko, but unfortunately this deck is very black heavy. So we just don't have the density of blue cards to consistently have Commandeer online, so we don't run it. Finally, how do we win? The deck of course runs Thoughts of Consult, though the reanimation lines we use are ideally how we get there. Either using Hoarding Broodlord, Saw in Half, and Peer into the Abyss to just draw our deck and find ways to put together a win, or using Razaketh to simply tutor up our win con with enough creatures on the board. But in addition to those, we have 2 more win conditions, in Doomsday and Yuriko Beats. Doomsday is pretty straightforward. You cast Doomsday, you make the pile, you crack it with Yuriko trigger. The secret spice, however, is the pile itself. We don't run Gush or LED or Get Probe as they're just not great cards in our deck. However, we have made a pile that only uses 1 dead card in the deck, and it's only 4 mana. Now this pile lets us win with only 4 black mana, Doomsday for 3, and Stitcher Supplier for 1. The pile goes as such: Stitcher Supplier on top, followed by Thassa's Oracle, Narcomoeba, Dread Return, and the 5th card can be whatever you'd like. Now this 5th card can actually be moved up in the pile right under Stitcher Supplier if you have a way to get 2 Yuriko triggers, and that way the pile remains unchanged, but you have an additional card you can choose. Now you can crack the pile with your Yuriko trigger, reveal a Stitcher Supplier, cast Stitcher Supplier, milling Thoracle, Narcomoeba, and Dread Return, casting Dread Return for its flashback cost, sacrificing Narcomoeba, Stitcher Supplier, and the creature you attacked with, and returning Thassa's Oracle to the battlefield. This should win you the game with a Thassa's Oracle trigger, and if you had 2 triggers, you will have an additional card that can be interaction if you need it to be. While this supplier pile is very useful for us, it does require us running 1 dead card in the list in Narcomoeba. Not the worst card, but a 2-mana 1/1 that flies isn't the most useful, as it doesn't really do much for us outside of being a Yuriko attacker. Finally, the third way we can win the game is through Yuriko beats, and it's actually the second most common way this deck wins other than Thoracle. Now, with the help of newly released Roaming Throne and Bloodchief's Ascension to speed up the Yuriko clock and just pinging our opponents on their turns as well as ours, we can actually pressure our opponent's life totals fairly consistently and put pressure so much so that we usually win the game just through Yuriko triggers. Now that we've gone through the list, let's take a look at some sample hands. Alright, looking at this first hand, it does look promising, but it heavily relies on us top decking another land to start our game plan, and we never really want to be in a situation where we have to top deck lands so we're not out of the game. So we're going to have to take our free mulligan, go to our second 7. Looking at our second 7, lots of big creatures, but we're running into the same issue where we only have 1 land in our opener. We can operate on very few lands, but we have to be able to get Yuriko out turn 2 to start drawing cards, unless we have some other card advantage engine in our hand. Otherwise, we got to mull down to 6. Now this is a very good 6. We have our lands, we have Evasive Creature that can also set up our top decks, and Yuriko triggers, as well as an Entomb. If we can find a reanimation effect in our first few turns, we'll be looking for a good window to try to win. So we'll keep it, and we will be bottoming the Villas. Okay, looking at our second hand, this is exactly what we want to be seeing in this deck. We have a turn 1 Entomb that we can turn 2 reanimate with a little bit of protection, and ideally what we'll probably be targeting is Jin-Gitaxi's Core Augur, as if that gets to sit around the table, it's backbreaking for our opponents. Or we could go and tutor up a Broodlord if we draw into some rituals or fast mana. Either way, this is a snap keep for us. Let's take a look at one more set of 7. Looking at our first hand, it's a mulligan because we just don't have a second land, so we just have to keep going. Alright, we've gone from 1 land to no lands, so we're just going to go ahead and mulligan down to 6. Okay, our 6 is workable, but it's not doing anything on turn 1, and playing a 2-drop on turn 2 just isn't really fast enough in the current metagame. In a more Staxy pod, this would be fine, but I think we can do a little better, so we'll go down to 5. Alright, now this 5 is great, actually. We bottom the Oppo and the Force of Will and go into turn 2 with 2 possible Yuriko attackers. Now, a thing to keep in mind in this Yuriko list is that while ideally we do want to be entombing and reanimating creatures and just trying to get back as much advantage in our big creatures as we can, if we have to mulligan down from 7 or 6, our plan will shift to the Yuriko tempo plan. That makes our mulligans a little easier, as we're only looking for 2 lands and an evasive creature, and oftentimes Yuriko will dig us out of those low mulligans, so it's fine to be more aggressive with that. Now this is a very unique brew of Yuriko, and because of that it can be a bit of a headache to pilot. Because of the cards that we're choosing to play in this list, it does mulligan worse than typical Yuriko lists, but the trade-off is that we can seamlessly pivot to the table as needed between reanimation, tempo, and aggro with proper mulligans. And that is the deck. Now if you have any questions, leave them either here or on the list in Moxfield. I'll respond as best as I can to any questions about it. I want to thank you guys for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time.